The ink on the page has darkened with time, turning from midnight black to the color of dried tea. The strokes are uneven, sometimes trembling, sometimes decisive, as if the hand that held the brush could never quite decide whether it was writing a report for the king or a confession for history itself. This is not the diary of a man who slept peacefully. It is the record of a commander who woke each morning unsure if his country, his fleet, or his own name would still exist by nightfall. The date inscribed, sometime in the late 16th century, speaks of a time when the very air over the Korean peninsula tasted of smoke, salt, and unending dread. This small, leather-bound book, the Nanjung Ilgi or War Diary, written by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, is our first window into a world of profound existential crisis. It is an artifact not of glory, but of desperate, methodical, and lonely perseverance. It forces us to ask, what happens to the soul of a leader when the only reward for meticulous duty is the deepening certainty of betrayal and the promise of impending annihilation? And why do the greatest acts of national service often emerge not from confidence, but from a terrifying yet managed fear? We begin our journey into the deep reservoir of Korean humanities here, in the cold, salt-sprayed darkness of a flagship anchored against an overwhelming Japanese invasion force. But the story does not end with cannons and masts. It follows the trajectories of four minds, spanning 2 centuries of crisis, each wrestling with the collapse of order, moral, political, and philosophical, and each leaving behind a testament that demands accountability, integrity, and radical self-reflection. These four colossal works, Yi Sun-sin's Nanjung Ilgi, The War Diary, Ryu Seongrayang's Jingbarak, Record of Troubles Ameliorated, Jeong Yak-Yong's Mokminsim Seo, Admonitions on Governing the People, and Park Jae-won's Jaha Diary, A Critique of Civilization, are not mere historical documents. They are crucibles forging the very definition of Korean ethical leadership. They interpret the universal human conditions of fear, failure, responsibility, and global awareness, using the specific, difficult history of the Joseon dynasty as their laboratory. The world these men inhabited was governed by the exacting, beautiful, yet increasingly rigid philosophy of Neo-Confucianism. This ideology, imported from China, provided a comprehensive social architecture, demanding moral purity, hierarchical order, and relentless classical scholarship. Every scholar, every official, every father was expected to fulfill his defined role, from the king, high out to heaven, down to the commoner, high out to the ancestral line. But by the late 16th century, this elegant system began to rust. The Yongbin scholar gentry, ostensibly the moral guardians of the realm, had grown complacent. Factionalism, or danging, had become an obsession, prioritizing ideological loyalty and internal political maneuvering over the tangible welfare of the state. While scholars in the capital debated the subtle metaphysics of Li principle and Qi material force, whether cosmic structure preceded physical reality or vice versa, the naval defenses crumbled, the tax system became a mechanism for extortion, and the military neglected its duties. The theoretical purity of the elite had created a practical vacuum that invited disaster. Then came 1592, the year of the Imjin War, when Japanese forces under Toyotomi Hideyoshi shattered the delicate peace and proved that ritual and abstract morality offer no defense against a disciplined, technologically superior invading army. The Neo-Confucian architecture, which had stood for 2 centuries, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The king fled the capital, the armies dissolved, and chaos reigned. This was the historical and psychological ground zero that necessitated the radical reassessment embodied in our four texts. Our first author, Admiral Yi Sun-sin, faces this collapse head-on. His diary begins not in a moment of victory, but in perpetual political peril. He was a commander of unquestionable competence, but his uncompromising integrity made him a constant target of the court's jealous, factionalized power brokers. He records not only weather reports and battle maneuvers, but the ceaseless headache of betrayal. The War Diary is a text of almost agonizing psychological restraint, writes one scholar. Unlike other generals who exaggerated their deeds, Yi's prose is terse, factual, and brutally honest about his own emotional state. His entries are less about what the enemy did and more about the crushing weight of command. One day, after a minor skirmish that saw his fleet outnumbered, he wrote, "My liver and gall were split apart with vexation." This is the language of physical pain born from moral outrage and overwhelming responsibility. It is the language of Han, that deeply lodged, collective, and personal sorrow rooted in profound injustice. now focused onto the administrative failures of his superiors and the existential threat to his people. The reality of his command was not glorious, it was meticulous and mundane. Each entry confirms he was his own supply master, his own intelligence agent, his own disciplinary officer. He records punishing deserters, managing grain supplies, overseeing the creation of gunpowder, and repairing the iconic turtle ships. His virtue was not an abstract pursuit, but a necessary administrative tool. If he were seen indulging in luxury, his men would lose trust. If he failed to keep meticulous financial records, the enemy would not be the Japanese, but starvation and mutiny. We see the depth of his despair in simple entries, too. After a victory, instead of celebrating, he often recorded the names of the few men lost and then added a single chilling line: "The enemy remains strong. I do not know how we will survive the future." The modern leader, accustomed to strategic obfuscation or emotional grandstanding, can learn from this profound authenticity. Ye's diary reveals that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the methodical execution of duty despite the omnipresence of terror and incompetence in the political system above him. His greatest fear was not death in battle but the failure of command. The diary details the constant threat of false accusation. At one point, he was recalled to the capital, stripped of his rank, imprisoned and tortured, a victim of the very court he was saving. His crime was refusing an obviously suicidal order engineered by factional rivals. Even facing the rack, his integrity never wavered. He understood that obedience to an incompetent state was treason to the nation. This choice, choosing national survival over personal survival within the hierarchy, is the core moral climax of the Nanjing Ilgi. The legacy of Yi Sun-sin, documented in his diary, is one of uncompromising integrity under duress. It demands that leaders focus on empirical reality, sil-sa-gu-si, over political theater. For today's globalized world, where ethical lapses and transactional leadership are common, Yi's diary is a cold, stark mirror. It suggests that competence and morality are not complementary skills but mutually dependent forces. A leader who is corrupt cannot be competent because corruption requires the constant squandering of energy on deceit. The political trauma that produced Yi Sun-sin's diary also necessitated our second major text, the Jingbirok, or Record of Troubles Ameliorated, penned by Ryu Seong-ryung. Ryu Seong-ryung was the chief state counselor, or prime minister, who had been Admiral Yi's friend, mentor, and steadfast political protector. Where Yi was the warrior focused on the immediate tactical front, Ryu was the grand strategist overseeing the diplomatic and administrative collapse. He was responsible for the political failures that allowed the war to start and the administrative chaos that followed. The Jingbirok is not a celebration of victory, it is a monument to shame. Its title Jingbai means to discipline oneself against and to guard against future error. It is a work of historical accountability written by a survivor who felt he had failed the dead. The book is an exhaustive post-mortem of the war's causes, the government's panicked response, and the systemic errors that nearly destroyed the nation. Ryu Seong-ryung wrote this history after he, too, had been purged and exiled once the dust settled. He wrote it not for public consumption, but for his own moral reckoning and as a chilling warning for his descendants and future officials. The text is saturated with the Confucian concept of self-recrimination, the intellectual and moral duty to analyze one's own failure without mitigation or blame-shifting. He detailed, often in agonizing detail, the moments of political paralysis. He described the officials in the capital, frozen by factionalism, unable to agree on a single, coherent response even as the enemy approached the gates. He recounted the desperation of the king's flight and the humiliation of seeking aid from the Ming dynasty, admitting that the entire ruling class had forfeited its right to govern. In one passage, Ryu describes the fatal negligence of pre-war preparations. Though the danger was imminent, the officials of the capital did not take it seriously. Everyone indulged in poetry and drink, claiming that the Japanese would never dare to cross the sea. This indictment is not merely historical. It is a condemnation of the entire intellectual class that prioritized aesthetic pursuit and abstract philosophy over tangible national defense. The Jingbirok teaches a brutal lesson in accountability and institutional memory. Ryu Seong-ryung understood that if the trauma of the Imjin War were simply forgotten or sanitized into heroic myth, the structural flaws that caused it, the bureaucratic incompetence, the factional poisoning, the moral decay of the elite would inevitably repeat themselves. The book is an administrative play for future generations to learn from documented pain. The contemporary resonance is undeniable. In an era of organizational denial, where leaders often hide failures or outsource blame, the Jingbirok insists that true leadership requires owning the catastrophic failures of the system you inherit and command. It suggests that the act of painful reflection is the first, indispensable act of genuine reform. It is the necessary bridge between a catastrophic past and a viable future, built entirely on the fragile pillars of documented acknowledged shame. Yet even after the war passed and the Jingbirok was buried in silence for a time, the systemic rot that Siyong had documented only metastasized. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Joseon dynasty faced a new, slower, yet equally deadly crisis: the decay of its local administrative core. This brings us to our third profound thinker, Jeong Yak-Yong, better known by his pen name Dasan T. Mountain. Born into the same Yongbin class that had failed in 1592, Dasan lived through the final golden age of reform under King Jeongjo, only to suffer a brutal political purge that sent him into 18 years of exile to the remote coastal town of Gangjin. Dasan was a scholar of staggering breadth, an engineer, a legal expert, an astronomer, and a political philosopher, but his genius was constrained by the suffocating political system. Like Seongrayang before him, Dasan's greatest work was forged in the crucible of isolation and political failure. His masterpiece, the Monumental, Admonitions on Governing the People, is the definitive treatise on public service ethics and administrative science in Korean history. It is a work that fundamentally redefines the role of the governing official, the Mokmin-gwan, the local magistrate, arguing that the stability of the state rests entirely on the integrity and competence of the man at the lowest administrative rung. Dasan's world was collapsing not due to foreign invasion, but due to internal extraction. The tax system was a mechanism of state-sanctioned theft. The three taxes crisis, Samjeong, involving land tax, military service tax, and the grain loan system, had been corrupted to the point where local functionaries and petty officials, the Ajan, could perpetually bleed the peasantry dry, knowing the distant magistrate would rarely intervene. Dasan's text is a direct attack on the scholar-official class for its detachment. He charged that the Neo-Confucian elite were too obsessed with abstract debates about virtue to notice that their own administrative system was creating mass starvation and rebellion. His Mokmin-Simseo demands a pivot to silhak, or practical learning, knowledge that is useful, empirical, and applied to the tangible welfare of the common people min. The book is structured as a detailed manual, following the magistrate from the moment he takes office to the day he retires. It is utterly devoid of philosophical abstraction. Every section deals with concrete procedures, from auditing grain reserves and managing public works to presiding over litigations and managing subordinate staff. Dasan's administrative vision is rooted in three core ethical principles: self-discipline, yulgi, public service, bonggong, and love for the people min. Crucially, he argues that the official must first conquer himself. The section on yulgi demands rigorous personal integrity and extreme frugality. Dasan warns the magistrate against all forms of personal luxury and illicit gain, observing that even acts done in secret at midnight will eventually be exposed. He insists that a magistrate who accepts lavish gifts or lives extravagantly immediately forfeits the moral authority necessary to govern honestly. His dignity comes from his ascetic conduct, not his punitive power. This focus on personal integrity is the foundation for effective external governance. How can a magistrate effectively manage the financial corruption of his subordinate Ajan if his own hands are tainted by similar avarice? The answer, Dasan realized, is that he cannot. Therefore, self-governance is the prerequisite for public service. The principle of min, love for the people, is the realization of the Confucian virtue of benevolence, channeled specifically through the concept of Ya Chinese letter or compassion. Dasan elevates Ya as the guiding star for administration, treating the people as a parent treats a vulnerable child. This is not mere pity, it is an active, expert stewardship. Dasan demands that officials engage in seeking truth from facts, silsagusi. For example, in managing litigation, he cautions the magistrate against relying on the prepared testimony of clerks, who often manipulate facts. The official must cross-examine witnesses directly, thoroughly, and fairly, ensuring that the poor and uneducated are not overwhelmed by the bureaucratic machinery. His focus on economic justice is relentless. He instructs magistrates on how to conduct famine relief, Yak-Yong, ensuring that grain is distributed without corruption and that land is assessed fairly based on actual yield, not historical precedent or political pressure. He writes, "If the official collects 1 cent more than is necessary, he has robbed the people." This administrative vision is the ultimate counter-narrative to the prevailing political reality of the late Joseon. For the modern civil servant, the Mokminsimseo provides a timeless ethical template. It anticipates contemporary concepts of fiduciary duty, where a professional, the magistrate, the doctor, the CEO holds specialized knowledge and power that demands the prioritization of the dependent party's interest, the people, the patient, the shareholder above their own. Dasan teaches that public administration is a moral, technical science, and incompetence or corruption in governance is ultimately a betrayal of trust. The crises detailed by Yi Sun-sin and Ryu Seong-ryung concerned internal collapse and external military threat. Jeong Yak-Yong focused on internal administrative decay. Our fourth figure, Park Jae-won, confronts the greatest philosophical crisis of all, the collapse of the Joseon worldview. Park Jae-won, known as Yeonem Swallow Rock, was another key figure in the Silhak movement, a near contemporary of Dasan. But where Dasan focused his reforming gaze inward on bureaucratic ethics, Yeonem directed his attention outward, challenging Joseon's deep-seated cultural and ideological isolation. Joseon had long viewed itself as the last bastion of true Confucian civilization, clinging to the Ming dynasty's traditions even after the Ming fell to the northern Manchu Qing Empire in 1644. For the Joseon elite, the Qing was a nation of barbarians, their culture tainted by foreign ways. This ideology justified deep isolationism and a philosophical stagnation that rejected foreign technology and new ideas. In 1780, Park Jae-won joined an annual diplomatic mission, the Yeonhingsa, traveling north to the Qing court in Beijing and beyond, into the vast northern region of Jehal. His resulting travelogue, the Yolha Ilgi Jaha Diary, is one of the most intellectually thrilling documents in East Asian literature, a masterclass in comparative civilization and cultural critique. Yeonem did not write a simple travel guide, he wrote an intellectual explosion. The moment he crossed the Yalu River, he began a radical reassessment of everything his society believed. The first shock was the sheer scale and vitality of the Qing Empire. He saw roads, bridges, and infrastructure that dwarfed anything in Joseon. He observed advanced technologies, sophisticated commerce, and a bustling, pragmatic society. The heart of the Jaha Diary is Yeonem's attack on Joseon's intellectual arrogance, known as the Discourse on Overcoming Mountains and Rivers. He chastised his fellow Confucian scholars for their self-imposed ignorance. They would cross great rivers and climb towering mountains, yet they would write only poetry lamenting their fatigue or comparing the scenery to ancient Chinese paintings. They refused to see the world for what it was. They only saw what Neo-Confucian texts had trained them to see. Yeonem, in contrast, embraced the foreign gaze. He meticulously documented everything, the structure of Qing carriages, the construction of their brick kilns, the design of their houses. He sought utility above all. He was determined to introduce the concept of the carriage and cart to Joseon, a simple idea that would revolutionize transport but had been blocked by Joseon tradition, which saw wheeled vehicles as destabilizing to their moral agrarian society. Yeonem's philosophy, often summarized as Iyang Husing, practical utilization for the people's livelihood, was the logical philosophical extension of Yi Sun-sin's empirical honesty and Dasan's administrative pragmatism. He argued that the true measure of civilization was not the purity of its rituals or the elegance of its calligraphy, but its ability to improve the material lives of its common citizens. If the barbarians had a technology that could benefit the people, then that technology, regardless of its origin, was superior to the stagnant tradition that denied it. This cultural critique was an act of profound intellectual courage. In effect, Yeonem was arguing that Joseon must sacrifice its idealized image of itself as the center of Confucian morality and humbly learn from the very barbarians it disdained, simply because the barbarians were better at governing effectively. The Jaha Diary serves as a timeless document on global citizenship and the necessity of comparative civilization. In a globalized world, nations and organizations often succumb to institutional arrogance, refusing to adopt best practices because of cultural pride or fear of change. Yonam teaches us that intellectual humility and aggressive curiosity about the outside world are not signs of weakness, but the very prerequisites for national strength and continued relevance. The journeys of these four men, Yisun Sin, Ryu Seongrayong, Jeong Yak-Yong, and Park Jae-won, form a continuous narrative arc spanning 250 years, documenting the evolution of Korean leadership ethics from military crisis to administrative reform and finally to global awareness. Yisun Sin established the standard of integrity, duty above self, competence above politics. His diary is the lonely voice of a principled professional in a transactional world. His meticulously kept records and his refusal to sacrifice his fleet for political expediency set an uncompromising bar for ethical command. Ryu Seongrayong created the doctrine of accountability and historical memory. His Jingbirok forces the defeated to confront their errors, insisting that future success is predicated upon a rigorous, painful analysis of past systemic failures. It is the charter of national honesty. Jeong Yak-Yong codified the philosophy of administrative service. His Mokmin Seo, forged in exile, provides the necessary practical and ethical infrastructure for a government that truly serves the people. It demands that morality be measured not by abstract principles, but by the tangible welfare of the common citizen. It is the guidebook for the righteous shepherd. Park Jae-won delivered the final mandate, pragmatism and global engagement. His Jaha Diary shattered the illusion of isolation, demanding that survival requires constant empirical study of the outside world, discarding cultural pride when utility dictates adaptation. Together, these four works offer a synthesis of Korean humanities rooted in the concept of responsibility in the face of chaos. Whether the chaos is military invasion, political collapse, administrative decay, or global shift, the response prescribed is always the same: rigorous self-discipline, empirical honesty, unwavering duty to the people, and a profound commitment to practical knowledge. But these were not just books written in isolation. They were lived experiences of profound hardship and internal conflict. Let us delve deeper into the psychological reality of these men, moving beyond the text and into the trembling hand that held the brush. Consider Admiral Yisun Sin again, in the mid-1590s. The entries in the Nanjung Ilgi are often startlingly intimate, revealing a man profoundly alienated from his peers and burdened by the sheer scale of the historical catastrophe. He was a man raised in a society that valued literary elegance and abstract moral purity, yet he was forced by necessity to become an engineering pragmatist and a political pariah. His daily life was a relentless exercise in sugi self-cultivation, stripped of all comfort. His diary records him falling ill frequently, the stress manifesting in physical pain. He was often forced to execute those who abandoned their duties, a moral trauma he recorded with cold precision. The dichotomy of his existence was agonizing. He was a loyal subject saving the dynasty, yet the dynasty constantly sought his death. On one particularly bleak day, after hearing yet another rumor of a political plot against him, he did not rage. He simply wrote, "I could not sleep sitting until dawn." This short sentence, devoid of detail, contains the weight of a man sacrificing his peace, his reputation, and his life for a state that had condemned him. This is the internal battlefield of duty, where the enemy is not the fleet on the horizon, but the weariness in one's own soul. His leadership style, reflected in the diary, was one of radical transparency with his subordinates but absolute opacity regarding his internal despair. He managed the fear of his men by ensuring their provisions were secure and their training was relentless, practical acts of care that demonstrated his competency. He channeled his deep, righteous anger at political injustice, not into rebellion, but into the meticulous construction of victory. He transformed his personal suffering into the raw energy needed for the nation's survival. Contrast this active, contained Han with the deep shame recorded in Ryu Seongrayong's Jingbirok. When Ryu wrote, "The war was over, the glory was gone, and only the stench of death remained." His exile was not merely political punishment. It was a communal rite of cleansing, demanding that he, the man at the height of power when the nation fell, must assume the sins of the Yongbin class. The philosophical extension of the Jingbirok concerns the fiduciary responsibility of the ruling elite. Ryu understood that political failure is not a statistical anomaly, but a moral breach of the mandate of heaven, and that the duty of the survivor is not to justify themselves, but to ensure the cost of that breach is never forgotten. He details the specific administrative structures that failed, the broken communication lines, the insufficient military grants, the flawed general selection process. His introspection suggests that true reform begins only when the powerful acknowledge their own incompetence without reservation. Imagine Ryu Seongrayong in his isolated hut, his hands cramped from writing, surrounded by the ghosts of the millions who died. He doesn't write, "I tried my best." He writes, "My efforts were inadequate, my decisions were slow, I did not foresee the danger." This profound act of political confession creates the philosophical requirement for institutional self-correction, a necessary function for any modern nation or large corporation seeking longevity. You cannot fix what you refuse to name. This deep intellectual current of self-critique found its most systematic voice nearly 2 centuries later with Jeong Yak-Yong Dasan. Dasan's exile to Gangjin 1801–1818 was a period of intense intellectual production, a testament to the Korean ideal of scholarly perseverance through political adversity. The political system had rejected him, yet he committed himself to writing a systematic guide on how that same system could be perfected. His Mokminsim became the definitive blueprint for the enlightened official that the Joseon court had desperately needed but failed to cultivate. Dasan's profound observation was that the crisis of Joseon was not ideological, it was managerial. The abstract virtue promoted by Neo-Confucianism had become a shield for incompetence and greed. He recognized that the ultimate failure was the exploitation of information asymmetry. The temporary magistrate knew little, the entrenched local ajan knew everything, and they used that knowledge to manipulate records and extort the people. Dasan's solutions were technical, but driven by moral necessity. For instance, in his sections on taxation, he detailed how a magistrate must personally verify local crop yields, rather than accepting the fraudulent reports provided by local clerks who consistently inflated figures to skim the surplus. This insistence on empirical verification became the practical cornerstone of the Silhak movement. He demanded that the magistrate view his job as an act of continuous, practical compassion. This meant actively intervening to protect the most vulnerable. Consider the sections on local justice, where Dasan warns officials against the temptation of swift, brutal judgment. He insists on patience, thorough investigation, and the avoidance of torture, recognizing that a magistrate's arbitrary severity is merely another form of exploitation. When you judge a case, he instructs, you must ask yourself, is this judgment based on fact, or are you merely seeking to please your superiors or avoid further work? This internal audit, detailed in the Mokminsim, defines the moral high ground of public service. It transforms the often corrupt local office into a laboratory for applied ethics. The moral force of Dasan's work comes from the stark reality of his writing environment. He wrote the Mokminsim while living in poverty, relying on the charity of local people, watching the misery of the peasantry firsthand. He wrote the manual for the officials he was not allowed to be, for the people he could not actively serve. The sincerity of his detailed advice is thus unassailable. It is the truth of a martyr channeled into administrative science. The final element necessary to complete this quartet of conscience is the courage to look outward, a challenge taken up by Park Jae-won. Yeonam's Jaha Diary is the necessary corrective to the endemic parochialism of Joseon. Where Dasan taught the magistrate how to govern within the state, Yeonam showed the intellectual elite why they must first understand the world outside the state. His journey to the Qing capital was not diplomatic, it was ethnographic and philosophical. The core of Yeonam's genius was his utilitarian skepticism. He questioned the inherent superiority of Joseon's culture, not out of self-loathing, but out of a fierce commitment to practical benefit. Hyusing. He described observing a Qing farmer operating a complex, multi-wheeled plow far more efficiently than the simple oxen-pulled plow used in Joseon. His immediate reaction was not cultural offense at using a barbarian tool, but practical astonishment at Joseon's self-imposed inefficiency. He asked, why is our loyalty to antique ritual greater than our compassion for the farmer whose back breaks under unnecessary labor? Yeonam's criticism extended beyond technology to culture itself. He noted the Qing people's pragmatic approach to problem solving, their lack of obsession with ancient literary formalism, and their ability to adapt and innovate. He argued that the true measure of a great civilization is its ability to create wealth and ease suffering, not its rigid adherence to past glory. His prose, unlike the somber gravity of Yi and Ryu or the systematic rigor of Dasan, is often vibrant, satirical, and deeply sensory. He recorded the noise of the bustling northern markets, the vastness of the Chinese landscape, the efficiency of their administrative posts. By describing the foreign world in such meticulous, vivid detail, Yeonam forced the insulated Joseon readers to confront a terrifying fact. The world had moved on, and their moral isolation had rendered them weak and poor. The most potent philosophical message of the Jaha Diary is the concept of intellectual humility on a global scale. Yeonam demonstrated that the pursuit of truth, silhak, requires actively seeking out knowledge, regardless of whether it comes from a politically palatable source. For today's global leadership, facing complex cross-cultural challenges, Yeonam's legacy insists that the refusal to learn from rivals or unfamiliar cultures is not an act of loyalty, but an act of self-destruction. These four colossal works, the War Diary, the Confession, the Administrative Manual, and the Travelogue, are bound by a single powerful thread, the relentless pursuit of moral integrity defined by practical outcomes. They redefine leadership not as the possession of status or power, but as the execution of difficult, often thankless duty, rooted in empirical truth and public welfare. The ultimate climax of this historical narrative is the synthesis of these four perspectives into a holistic Korean philosophy of duty. The trauma of the Imjin War, Yi and Ryu, revealed that the state required competence, honesty, and painful institutional memory to survive military crisis. The decay of the late Joseon, Dasan showed that this integrity must be applied systematically to administration, demanding self-discipline and empathy toward the governed. The external threat, Yeonam, taught that survival requires intellectual flexibility and a willingness to learn from the outside world. The synthesis can be summarized in one overarching command: action is the true measure of virtue. For Yi Sun-sin, virtue was manifested in the meticulous counting of rations and the steady repair of the fleet. For Ryu Seong-ryung, virtue was manifested in the honest accounting of historical failure. For Jeong Yak-Yong, virtue was manifested in the detailed blueprint for fair taxation and judicial integrity. For Park Jae-won, virtue was manifested in the courage to praise the efficiency of a barbarian's cart. The philosophical weight of these texts remains immense in the 21st century. Today, when public discourse is dominated by abstract political performance and social media posturing, these Joseon masters offer a stark reminder of what true governance demands. The Mokminsim Seo's detailed critique of bureaucratic corruption, where officials prioritized personal wealth over public service, mirrors modern anxieties over conflicts of interest, corporate greed, and political self-dealing. Dasan's insistence on fiduciary responsibility, that the official serves the people first, is a direct, timeless challenge to any system where power becomes a path to personal enrichment. The Jingbirok's doctrine of accountability speaks directly to modern crises of leadership, whether in financial meltdowns, environmental disasters, or public health emergencies. It demands that leaders analyze failure not to mitigate legal risk, but to honor the collective pain of those affected, ensuring that the mistakes become irreversible institutional lessons. Yi Sun-sin's diary is a masterclass for any CEO, general, or manager navigating extreme pressure. It teaches that leadership in crisis requires brutal internal honesty, relentless preparation, and the moral strength to reject self-serving directives from above. His integrity was not a philosophical luxury, it was the mechanism that kept his fleet afloat. And Yeonam's Jaha Diary provides the blueprint for global citizenship, reminding modern nations that the greatest threat to security is often self-imposed isolation and ideological rigidity. In an age of rapid technological disruption, the willingness to humbly adopt superior foreign methods, Iyang-husing, remains the ultimate survival strategy. These four texts are not fragments of a dusty past, they are tools for critical engagement with the present. They ask us, the inhabitants of the modern world, to reflect on our own moral commitments. Where does our loyalty truly lie? with the system that feeds us or with the people that system is meant to serve. In Seoul, in London, in New York, we often speak of integrity as an abstract noun. These Korean masters defined it as a set of agonizing, necessary, and practical actions. Integrity is not what you profess. Integrity is the arduous, empirical labor detailed in the Mokminsim Seo. If the Joseon dynasty ultimately failed to implement the radical, painful reforms demanded by these four writers, that failure only underscores the extraordinary difficulty and perpetual necessity of their lessons. The dynasty fell, but the ideas survived, becoming the bedrock of a moral consciousness that informs Korea's enduring resilience and its powerful ethical demands on its public servants today. The light of the 18th century is gone, replaced by the harsh fluorescence of the modern office, but the questions remain exactly the same. The ledger of history, transcribed by these lonely scholars and weary commanders, is open. It documents not the simple happiness of a people, but the complex, profound struggle for ethical survival. And somewhere in a small apartment in Seoul, a young civil servant closes the book, turns off the light, and realizes that the history he has just read is quietly judging the choices he will make tomorrow.